Now that we know some basics about plants, let's dive into what photosynthesis is and how it works. Photosynthesis is the process by which plants and other autotrophs use sunlight to convert carbon dioxide and water into energy. So to understand photosynthesis, we first need to understand a little bit about what energy is and ways that organisms store and use energy. Energy is the capacity to do work. There are two types of energy, and energy switches between these two forms depending on whether it is being used or stored. When we use energy, that is kinetic energy, the energy of motion. When we move our bodies or produce heat or light, that is kinetic energy. Stored energy is known as potential energy. An object's location, position, or composition can all store potential energy. For example, if you roll a ball to the top of a hill, its position there is a store of potential energy because it has the potential to roll down that hill. The energy stored in the molecules of our food is a form of potential energy. It has the potential to be released and used when we need it. Energy does not appear out of nowhere. According to the first law of thermodynamics, energy cannot be created or destroyed. Instead, when we use stored energy, it is converted into kinetic energy to allow our bodies to do some work. The energy in the sun is kinetic energy. For plants to make use of that energy, they need a way to store it as potential energy, so it's available when they need it. Some of the kinetic energy from the sun is absorbed by plants. The rest is transformed into heat. When you exercise, you are converting the potential energy stored in your food into kinetic energy. But some of that energy is also converted to heat, which is why you heat up when you exercise. This brings us to the second law of thermodynamics. No transformation of energy is perfectly efficient. Whenever we convert potential energy to kinetic energy, or vice versa, some of that energy is released as heat. If these transformations of energy were perfectly efficient, energy would be able to just cycle through the ecosystem, being transformed back and forth between kinetic and potential energy. But because living organisms can't use heat to power their cells, and some energy is released in the form of heat every time we transform energy, ecosystems need a way to bring in more energy and store it. This is what plants and primary producers do. A primary producer is an organism that traps the sun's kinetic energy and converts it into potential energy that can be used by cells. So how is energy stored in cells? Remember that energy can be stored in the bonds between molecules. That's how energy is stored in our food. In cells, energy is stored in a molecule called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. ATP has 3 phosphate groups attached to it, and that is where the energy gets stored. So triphosphate in ATP means 3 phosphate groups. So energy is stored in the bonds between the phosphate groups in ATP. And when these bonds are broken, some energy is released. Once one of these bonds break, we lose a phosphate group. We are left with adenosine diphosphate. Because of this, ATP and ADP work like a rechargeable battery. ATP is the charged state, and ADP is the uncharged state. When cells need energy to do work, they can break the bond between phosphate groups in ATP, releasing that potential energy. Then we have ADP, an uncharged battery. The cell can then store energy by adding a phosphate group back to ADP, forming ATP. So how are the bonds between phosphate groups actually able to store energy? Remember, when energy is stored, it's in the form of potential energy. Each of the phosphate groups is negatively charged. Similar to the magnets of the same pole, those negative charges push against each other, making the bonds unstable. You can think of these unstable bonds like a coiled spring. When we compress the spring, it wants to go back to its stable state. So we have stored potential energy in that spring. When we release it, the potential energy transforms into kinetic energy, and the spring goes back to its stable state. The same thing is happening in ATP. Potential energy is stored in those unstable bonds and released when they break, going to a more stable state. Now that we have the basics of energy and energy transformations down, let's talk about plants. First, we want to think about where the biomass of a plant comes from. So imagine you start growing a sunflower. You fill your pot with soil, plant your seed, and add a little water. Over time, your sunflower grows, adding to its biomass. But if you weighed the pots themselves, you would notice that the mass of the soil barely changes. So if the biomass added to your growing sunflower didn't come from the soil, where did it come from? Before we get to the answer, let's talk about growth. Plants and all living things on Earth are made up of carbon-based compounds. So for an organism to grow, it needs a source of carbon. Remember when we talked about the resources plants need, that we said they take in carbon dioxide from the air and nutrients like water, phosphorus, and nitrogen from the soil. So if plants are made up of carbon-based molecules, where does that carbon need to be coming from? That's right, it's coming from the carbon dioxide in the air.